This grainy, shaky phone footage is perhaps one of the few unifying and defining aspects of the Arab uprisings in 2011. From Tunisia to Bahrain, Syria to Yemen, and Egypt to Libya, people filmed their chants and demands on their smartphones and sent them to the world. Unedited, uncensored, uninterrupted. And it caught everyone off guard. To many, the use of social media in those demonstrations was one of the most important reasons for its rapid spread. Widespread discontent with the government in the Arab world prior to the 2011 uprisings was nothing new. But with media freedoms and organized dissent largely restricted, people had very little room to voice their grievances and mobilize. The introduction of social media changed things. It provided people with an alternative space to meet one another, campaign for change, and show the world an unfiltered image of the injustices they faced, all with a lower risk of government censorship and control.
There's a great debate on the role of social media during and especially at the outset of the Arab Spring. What most of us analysts have talked about is the three major T's, if you will, right? Tyranny, the role of prolonged tyranny in the region, the role of technology, but also the role of turmoil, especially economic turmoil and unemployment.
Everything in the Arab protests of 2011 started after the images of Mohammed Bouazizi setting himself on fire were shared on Facebook. In the months that followed, protesters across the region did the same. They documented government brutality, their protests, their solidarity with one another, and sent it to the world. Poor in quality but strong in content, those videos and images ultimately helped to galvanize people who flooded the streets. But it wasn't all that simple. To get to the streets in an effective fashion required organization. Where, when, and how were often sorted on Facebook. While this was not the case for all the different countries and throughout all the protests, it was certainly a hallmark of the Egyptian demonstrations. In places where internet usage was lower, like in Libya and Yemen, social media was not utilized to mobilize people as much, at least not in the beginning. It was more prominent in Tunisia and Egypt, where Facebook was used to organize protests and set up awareness campaigns. The best example of this is perhaps the We Are All Khalid Said campaign in Egypt, which had been active for months prior to the 25th of January 2011. It was an important page that raised awareness about corruption and police brutality, and ultimately used to mobilize and organize protests.
The role of images, not just going viral, but reflecting what people had been talking about for a while, led to this critical juncture. But it's not simply technology. It is built on a long legacy of activism. The toolkit of revolution, especially during the Arab Spring, was built on two very important pillars in a country, for example, like Egypt, which is a very long entrenched history of union activity and a very long entrenched history of protest, of workers' protest, for example, bread riots. And so if it wasn't for the long history of activism, it can't have built on it with the role of technology.
While technology and social media arguably played an important role in the protest movements, some analysts have argued that its role has been overstated. When governments eventually cut off access to social media and the internet during the protests, people continued to demonstrate. A prime example of that was in the early days of the Egyptian protests, when Twitter and Facebook were eventually blocked before the internet was completely shut down in the country on the 28th of January. For 5 days, almost 95% of the population had no access to the internet, but that only seemed to fuel people's anger further. Egypt went on to topple their government, as was the case in Tunisia, Yemen, and Libya.
We can't, for example, undercut that even during this moment where the internet was shut down, much of the interaction between citizens was occurring in that untapped space of political activism, which was the mosque, right? And university squares. And so it was those critical spaces also that participate in this. What happened with social media is a platform emerged which connected people through time, space, internationally, but also provided a medium where everyone could post, everyone could have a voice, and everyone could finally see what the everyday person was experiencing.
And while the debate around the impact of social media on the uprisings a decade ago remains disputed, the scene today looks starkly different. Aside from Tunisia, internet freedom has largely declined or remained stagnant since 2010, according to US think tank Council on Foreign Relations. Internet censorship on websites and social media pages has increased, and persecution of individuals over online posts has been emboldened by various new laws.
Today, what we're seeing is that this has become the space of surveillance. Just like squares were surveilled in the past and continue to be, today it's cyberspace. So for example, someone on Twitter that has over 5,000 followers, the regime now considers that person someone who can influence. And so if they tweet out anything out of the state narrative, they can be arrested and shut down under terrorism charges for defaming the image and the name of the state and putting out false information. And so that space of activism that was available in 2010, 2011 is no longer a space for freedom.
The platforms that once gave Arabs a space to demand their freedom and dignity may not be the same anymore, but very little suggests that those demands have changed. Sporadic protests across the region continue until today, as the underlying roots of the 2011 protests remain, and people continue to turn to social media to expose corruption and express their anger, despite all the risks involved.
Videos being released today with the high risk indicate a few things. Number one, that the moment of Arab Spring, while it may wax and wane, continues until today, that people continue to take risks. The second, protests being held. The interesting thing is that protests were happening in very poor rural areas. And so there still continues to be activity outside of this realm that we discuss that could actually be galvanized by individuals, whether internally or externally, that we're not analyzing. And third, and most critically, is the continued response of the attack on truth, the attack on what people actually see with their eyes as being untrue, that there is no repression, there is no violation of human rights, there is no pandemic, that there is equality, that there is access to healthcare, that regimes can put out these narratives and people actually start to believe them, is an indicator throughout the world that we're all suffering from the attack on truth and the attack on reality.